So this talk is not just going to be about polyrhythms, what they are, how to perform them, but also we're going to try and connect polyrhythms to other things. So on my YouTube channel, I have a show that I'm now calling New Horizons in Music, and so this is going to be the first live episode. I hope you enjoy. Peace. All right. That obnoxious thing. All right, so that was an introduction animated by Simon Franzman, really funny guy. Anyway, so we're gonna start with an introduction. So, on my channel, I get to explore a bunch of different topics. And one topic I explored recently was something that is very near and dear to my heart, something called synesthesia. Now, synesthesia is the pairing of two or more senses. And it's something that we actually all do, especially when we're talking about music. We'll pair adjectives that describe things in one sense, and we'll use it with our sense of hearing. For example, if you've ever heard a bright sound or a dark sound, or maybe a warm tone, or like a fat and punchy snare, or like a melody might be like sweet to the point of cloying. These are all terms that describe our sense of sight and our sense of smell and taste, but not our sense of hearing. But we understand the emotional impact of those adjectives, and we will relate it back to our hearing. And synesthesia is like this, except it kind of takes it up to the next level. This is called a cross-modal relationship whenever you have senses relating in this way, when you have adjectives from one using it as a metaphor for another. And people with synesthesia really kind of experience this in a very literal way. There's a form of synesthesia called chromesthesia, which basically it means that when you hear a sound, if you have chromesthesia, it's a neurological condition, when you hear a sound, you will literally see a color. And this chromesthesia means that the sound of a violin might actually sound orange or potentially sound blue. And this is really interesting to me, the idea of pairing color and sound. And when you have these experiences of pairing color and sound, they're called photisms, which I found that a really fun word, photism, because it almost has a science fiction aspect to it. And this idea of a photism, I don't have chromesthesia, I have another kind of synesthesia, but I do pair letters with colors. That's something called grapheme color synesthesia. But when people have the kind of synesthesia where you actually hear a color, I found that really interesting. I really wanted to explore that idea a lot more. I wanted to explore the idea of color and sound and see how far down the rabbit hole I could go. And turns out I'm not the first person to think about these things. In fact, there is a long lineage of people who have thought about the relationship of color and sound. One of them was this guy, Alexander Scriabin. He was an early 20th century Russian composer, a pretty amazing composer, and he composed a piece of music called Prometheus, a poem of fire. And in Prometheus, a poem of fire, you have an entire orchestra playing, but you also have this instrument playing, which he calls luce, but we know it as the color organ. And with a color organ, what you do is you play like a piano, like a normal keyboard on a normal organ, but every one of the keys represents a different color, and all the keys trigger a different colored light bulb. And so when you're hearing Prometheus, a poem of fire, you're not just hearing the music, but you're seeing the colors. And so when you have a performance of Prometheus, a poem of fire, you see these colors as if you're a chromesthete, seeing colors and hearing sound. And Scriabin got these ideas of color and sound from this guy, Isaac Newton. Excuse me. Isaac Newton wrote the definitive book on color science, it is titled Optics, in 1704. And in optics, which, by the way, is where we get Dark Side of the Moon, the whole refraction of color and light and getting the colors of the rainbow. In optics, there we go, he uses a lot of music metaphors to describe the relationships of color. And I found that really fascinating because he uses phrases like this one to describe which colors go well together. He says, for instance, green agrees with neither blue nor yellow, for it does not distance from them as far as not distant from them, but a note or a tone above and below. So, okay, that's pretty cool. And then he also says, orange agrees better with an indigo blue than with any other color, for they are fifths. Found that really interesting because modern Hollywood blockbusters all color grade their films with orange and blue. And we like this, we like this contrast between orange and blue. And if you think about this as like, hey, they're color grading with fifths, it's an interesting idea that we don't really think about. Like, we normally don't think about intervals with colors, but Isaac Newton sure was, and he was doing this many hundreds of years ago. And it makes a certain degree of sense. When you look at this 19th century color wheel, or a couple of color wheels, you see like the different colors around them, and you see that orange and blue are kind of like halfway across from each other. If you start at like orange and then you go like a little bit more than halfway around, you get to blue, and then you come back around where you started, you get orange again. Same thing with a major scale. You start with C, orange, I guess, and you go up like a little bit more than halfway, and then you get to blue, you get to this nice G, which is blue, fifth, and then you get back to orange. Now, Isaac Newton was thinking about these things, and in the original color wheel, the original like definition, how we understand color, he drew it like this, where there are musical notes all the way around it. He was thinking the 7 notes of the rainbow. In fact, he defined the rainbow as being 7 notes, sorry, did I say 7 notes of the rainbow? Yeah, so, I mean, it's kind of the point here. He's thinking of color and sound as the same sort of thing. And, I wanted to sort of like make this presentation sort of asking this question. This is like the thesis of today, not polyrhythms. Polyrhythms come later in the polyrhythms talk. I wanted to know if Isaac Newton is speaking metaphorically when he uses musical terms to talk about color, or is there something more?
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Yes. So Bill Clinton raises a good point. We need to figure out what the meaning of the word is. We need to try and like take a deeper look at this color-sound relationship. But before we do that, we have to sort of talk about the nature of sound, and the nature of sound as it relates to music. And so we're going to kind of put a pin on this. We're going to come back to this Isaac Newton thing. And now we're going to get into part 2. Pitch and rhythm are the same thing. So I mean this fairly literally, and I'll sort of explain it to you real quick. 1, pitch is defined by cycles per second. So how many times per second the air around your ear vibrates per second is how our brain perceives pitch. Air will hit the inner ear in something called the basilar membrane. They'll get converted to electrical signals, and the brain will perceive that and interpret that as pitch. So if something is vibrating 300 times per second, we will hear a note that is at 300 hertz. That's the definition of pitch, how we understand pitch. So, number 2, there are 60 seconds to a minute. This has nothing to do with music. This is just how we measure time. But number 3, rhythm, and this is how I'm defining rhythm fairly broadly. It says a steady tempo, so basically rhythm is a steady pulse, is determined by beats per minute, BPM. So 120 BPM, 200 BPM, whatever. It's like our understanding of steady pulse is defined by beats per minute. So basically, rhythm and pitch are the same. They just occur at slightly different speeds. And this is something that we kind of instinctually know. I don't really need to explain this to you, but just to give you an idea, if you have like a car engine starting up or a fan starting up, like these two things, you'll hear like a whir in the beginning, just a rhythmic motion of the blades, but eventually they go faster and faster and faster to the point where there's a hum, an audible hum. And that's essentially the phenomenon that we're talking about here. So human pitch perception lies between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. This is something that audio engineers have to deal with all the time in terms of equalization. Basically, if something is moving at 20 times per second or 20,000 times per second regularly, we will hear it as having pitch. This is a fairly kind of common knowledge sort of thing. I mean, if we have like hearing loss, like maybe it gets down to about like 15,000 hertz or something like that, but that's ish, ballpark. What not a lot of people know is that there's a limit of human rhythmic perception. And this is a very, very much an ish, but it's about 10 hertz. And when I say rhythmic perception, I mean our ability to distinguish between beats. So if you're playing something really fast, like ridiculously fast, like 10 hertz, like 10 notes per second, our ability to distinguish between the notes starts getting very, very blurred. And it's actually, it can get a little bit higher than this, like maybe up to like 12, 13 hertz, but 10 hertz is a good ballpark. So my question is, anything faster, trouble meaningfully distinguishing beats. My question is, what happens between 10 hertz and 20 hertz? If we hear something that is like at 15 hertz or 17 hertz, what is it? Well, let's find out. So here's a kick drum. It's going to slowly speed up. I want you to pay close attention to the moment that it turns into a pitch. Okay, about now, it sort of has a pitch now, and you can slowly hear it rise. But there was a moment in there where we didn't really know what the hell was going on. It was just this whatever. So this chart explains why. This blue line right here is our ability to perceive the differences between stimuli, so our rhythmic perception, and the higher it is, the less we're able to perceive the differences. And the red line is our pitch perception. And there's this weird nether realm in there, which I found really fascinating because it basically means there's a large gap in our perception. And you heard it. You heard that gap. You were not able to tell what was going on. So, what does this have to do with Isaac Newton? And what does this have to do with polyrhythms? Polyrhythms. I need to say that better. Polyrhythms. Okay. Well, not a whole lot, but let's put a pin in that. Pitch and rhythm are the same thing, and there's a gap in our perception. So, part 3. How to play polyrhythms. So, this is the practical fun part, fun, quote unquote. We're gonna figure out how to actually play a polyrhythm and how to play actually really complicated polyrhythms. We're gonna learn how to play 15 against 8. It's gonna be very simple. Everybody's gonna be doing it. So, this is the technical definition of a polyrhythm, the mathematical relationship between two or more simultaneous regular events, in parentheses, rhythms. This is a very dry definition, but it's kind of what we're going to be working with. Basically, two things are going to occur at the same time, and every so often they're going to line up. That's all I really want you to be thinking of. Not anything in terms of like tuplets or like quintuplets or anything like that. It's just two separate things which are occurring at the same time, and eventually at some point they both line up in the cycle. There's another thing that I want you to learn or know, and it's the term composite rhythm. And that's the sound of both streams of a polyrhythm occurring at the same time. So if you listen to the sound of like a major chord, right, or some sort of chord, let's say it's a major chord, you can pay attention and listen to the individual component parts of this chord, like the C, the E, or the G. I'm assuming we're in C major, by the way. And you can listen for those things, but most of the time we hear it as a composite. We hear everything together and we put a label to it. So that's the composite sound of a major chord. I want you to pay close attention to the composite rhythm of a polyrhythm. It's essentially the same idea. You want to listen to the general feel of the whole thing of it. So I'm going to basically play two metronomes, each clicking at like a different tempo, and they will have a 3-to-2 relationship. So the mathematical relationship between them, will be 3-to-2. One will be clicking at 150 beats per minute, and one will be clicking at 100 beats per minute. So this is the 100 beats per minute one, and this is 150. Both of them together. There's a composite there. Ta, ta, ka, ta, 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 ka, ta, 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 ka, ta. You're not really paying attention to the individual streams. You're hearing both of them together. And that's what I want you to like really be thinking about here, because that's how we perceive the rhythm. Now, we were conceiving this as kind of two metronomes, each clicking at different tempos, each playing quarter notes, because that's usually what a metronome is set to. And that's our musical conception of this. But there's a bunch of other ways that we can conceive of this particular composite rhythm. We could think of it as a couple of quarter notes and quarter note triplets in one tempo. So for every 2 quarter notes, you smush in 3 quarter note triplets. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is having a couple of dotted quarter notes in like a measure of 3/4. That's 2 notes per measure. And then 3 regular quarter notes in 3/4. That's 3 notes per measure. All 3 of these things essentially are the same thing. They're just different ways of conceptualizing it. It's different ways of conceptualizing this. 2 evenly spaced events in the same amount of time as 3 evenly spaced events. So how do we actually play these things? How do we conceive of them? Well,
I'm afraid we need to use math.
So not that much math. I just really wanted to use that Futurama clip. Okay. So the pen and paper method, this is how I learned, and this is how I encourage everybody to do this, because this is so easy, so straightforward. And it's a great way of basically conceptualizing really complicated things in a very straightforward manner. So first, we're going to draw X rows of Y numbers. So in the case of this like 2 against 3 sort of thing, we're going to draw 2 rows of 3 numbers. Now, each one of these rows is going to represent a pulse, like how we're going to feel it, the heartbeat of this polyrhythm. And then each one of the numbers is kind of the subdivision of that pulse, if you want to think about it that way. So we're going to bring out a piece of paper and draw 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Great, cool. So that 1, 2, 3 again, 1, 2, 3, X is the pulse, Y is the subdivision. So next, we're going to circle every X numbers. In this case, X is 2, so we're going to go left to right in order, kind of like how we would read. We're going to circle 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, so this is now our map on how to perform a 2 against 3 polyrhythm. And this is important. So we're going to go hand 1 is going to snap on number 1. Or sorry, hand X is going to snap on number 1, and hand Y is going to snap on the circles. This is why I named it X and Y, so I didn't get hand 1, number 1, anyway. Okay, so I'm going to kind of do it into this. Yeah, there we go. Do it right into here. I'm going to sort of walk us through this. So hand 1 is going to snap on the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This hand is going to snap on all of the circles. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So both of them together will sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1. So pretty soon I can get into this composite rhythm. This is the same composite rhythm that we were just hearing earlier. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The goal of this is to achieve this composite rhythm. The goal is not to count really quickly. The goal is to feel it. I'm not counting when I go. I'm just feeling it, man. That's basically all it is. I'm using this sort of mathematical approach, which we'll do a couple more times just so everybody gets the hang of it. We can do it for anything. And the goal of this is to achieve this composite rhythm. So what about another one? Let's do something a little bit trickier. This one's going to be a little bit harder to feel, but the process is exactly the same as the first one. We're going to do 4 against 5. Okay, so this means that there's going to be 4 notes in the same amount of time as 5 notes, 4 evenly spaced notes in the same amount of time as 5 notes. We're going to do the same process. We're going to draw X rows of Y numbers, very straight, yeah, or 4 rows of 5 numbers, cool. We're going to do that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4 rows. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did the first time, and we're going to circle every X numbers. Cool. So we're going to go it's fast. I sped it up too much in QuickTime. Oh well. Yeah. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is 4 against 5. Sweet. Now hand X is going to snap on number 1. Hand Y is going to snap on the circles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so if we do both of them together, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everybody now. All right. So it's kind of tricky. It does require a fair amount of practice to really get into that groove of that thing, but it's not undoable. Undoable? It's not impossible. That's the word. Oh, yeah. English is my first language. Okay, so that's the process, and we can do that for anything. You could do it for some absurd polyrhythm that makes no sense whatsoever. You could do like 32 against 31 if you wanted to. It's the same process. Now, whether or not you're able to eventually feel this composite rhythm is tricky. Like that question comes down to a lot of practicing these things and like really doing it over and over and over again, really getting into the feel of it. Let's do a really tricky one, and this is the one I mentioned earlier. Let's do 15 against 8. Okay, same process. We're going to draw 15 rows of 8 numbers apiece, and we're going to circle every 15th number. So I'm going to do this for you. I'm definitely not going to be feeling it at all. I'm just going to be counting it. I'm just going to be at the intellectualization stage of things. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1. Okay, that's one cycle of 15 against 8. So if you go back to the tape and you sped that up, you would hear 15 against 8. Now, here's the thing. I'm not feeling that. Nobody can really feel that, at least on the first couple of practices. It might take many years to be able to feel that at a fast tempo. So what we can say is the more complicated the relationship is between X and Y, the longer it takes for the polyrhythm to resolve, and the harder it is to feel. So, 3 against 2 is the same thing, or 3 against 2 or 2 against 3 the same thing. It's easy to feel, but 15 against 8 definitely is not. So that was the practical polyrhythm side of things. That was the point of the talk. That's why maybe some of you came. What does this have to do with Isaac Newton? Oh my God. Okay, we have 3 separate thoughts that we're kind of juggling here. How to play polyrhythms, speed and pitch, or pitch and rhythm are the same thing. Isaac Newton really likes his color music. So we're going to start tying everything together. Part 4. Everything is rhythm. So this is the fun part. This is a really fun part, I think. If rhythm is pitch, polyrhythm should equal polypitch, right? If we have a bunch of different rhythms occurring at the same time, it should give us harmony if we speed it up. It sure does. All intervals and all harmony are polyrhythmic, is polyrhythmic. Cool. So this is not that particular, it's not that new of a concept. Honestly, this goes back to Pythagoras of the Greeks. In addition to giving us the Pythagorean theorem and laying the basis for modern mathematics, he also laid the basis for modern music. And he did a bunch of experiments with this thing, which is called a monochord. And basically what he did is he divided this string, monochord, one string, into different lengths and compared the proportions of the different lengths to one another and tried to figure out what the best proportions were. And it turns out simple proportions equals sounds good. That's the simple thing. That's basically the straightforward way of understanding how music works. Simple proportions equals sounds good. Now, the proportions, exact proportions that Pythagoras used have changed over the many centuries, millennia, but the ones that we use today, roughly, I'm going to put an asterisk on this, but roughly the ones that we use today are these. Major second is 9 against 8. That means if you had a string length like 9 inches long and compared it to a string length that was 8 inches long, they would produce a major second. Major thirds, 5 against 4. Perfect fourth is 4 against 3. Perfect fifth is 3 against 2. Major sixth is 5 against 3. Major seventh is 15 against 8. Oh, where did we see that one? And octave is 2 against 1. You can do this with chords too, because when you combine different intervals together, you can find the common denominators between everything and then come up with chordal relationships. So a major chord is 4 against 5 against 6. So my question is, what is the relationship of these string lengths to the polyrhythms that we were talking about? Well, it turns out it's the exact same thing. Polyrhythms and string lengths end up being the same sort of proportions, and I will prove it to you. I want you guys in this next demonstration to pay close attention to the feeling of the polyrhythm of 4 against 5 against 6. 4 evenly spaced pulses in the same amount of time as 5 evenly spaced pulses, as in the same amount of time as 6 evenly spaced pulses. Pay close attention to how the polyrhythm makes you feel. Then I'm going to speed it up, and then like magic, it will turn into a major chord. I might have just ruined it for you, but let's try it. So this is a regular kick drum. I'm going to layer in the polyrhythm. Feels pretty cool, actually. When you speed it up, major chord. Slow it back down. I always found that funny that it's such a triumphant rhythm. The major chord has such a it sounds like a major chord. And you know, this is the case for any chord, any harmony. Anytime you have more than one note, you can break it down to its polyrhythm. And here's the thing, polyrhythms that are easy to feel are easy to hear when they're sped up. We had a good time listening to the So that means consonants, the idea of something sounding good. That's like kind of a oversimplification, but consonants is just polyrhythms which are easy to hear/feel. That's all it is. Anytime that you hear something that sounds good to you and sounds stable, it's just a polyrhythm which is easy to hear/feel. Now, I mean, the term good, sounds good, is, I mean it just in the sense of something that sounds rested, there's no tension. Maybe tension feels good to you, maybe tension sounds good to you. So if tension sounds and feels good to you, maybe you need a polyrhythm which creates tension. So we're going to start with a perfect fourth, which if you think about a perfect fourth, it's not particularly, there's not a lot of tension to it. And if you look at the ratio of a perfect fourth, 4 against 3, that's not particularly complicated. But if we then listen to a major seventh, there's a fair amount of tension in the interval of a major seventh, 15 against 8. And when you compare the two of them, and we put the two of them layered on, so in the key of C, this would be a C, an F, and a B. It's going to be a pretty spicy sort of chord. So I want you to listen when we do this next demonstration to first the, where I'm going to layer in the perfect fourth. So it's just going to be this like nice consonant 4 against 3 polyrhythm. And then I'm going to layer in the 15 against 8. And then you're going to hear cacophony. It's going to be really dissonant. It's going to be a dissonant polyrhythm. And then we're going to speed it up, and then you're going to hear the harmony that's the result, and you'll hear that dissonance. So. Feels good. All right. 15 against 8 is not going to feel good. If you really spend some time with it, you'd be able to hear it maybe, but oh God, it's hard. It sounds like popcorn going off. When you speed it up, so, polyrhythms that are hard to feel are hard to hear when they're sped up. So dissonance is just polyrhythms which are hard to hear/feel. We like the sort of the juxtaposition of tension and release. We like the release that comes from being able to hear when the polyrhythm resolves, like in the major chord. We like to hear the beginning of that phrase. But we also like when there's tension, because then it makes those moments of resolution so much sweeter. And we just heard it play out on 2 planes. We heard it play out on the rhythmic plane, and then also on the pitch plane. And I found that really, really interesting when I was first getting into this stuff. One book that sort of illuminated a lot of things for me was this book by Henry Cowell, New Musical Resources. And he talks about something called tempo scales in this book. It's a very influential book for a lot of different thinkers of the 20th century. Including, Conlon Nancarrow, who's a pretty amazing, if you don't know Conlon Nancarrow, it's probably the most insane music you'll ever hear. But he was very, very influenced by this book and the idea of tempo scales. Polyrhythms, beats per minute, and notes are all the same. There's this chart in this book where he basically says, this is the ratio from C, these are the tones of the chromatic scale, these are the equivalent BPMs. All of them are the same. We just think of them slightly differently depending on our musical needs. And, here's the question, though. What does this have to do with Isaac Newton? We're getting there, guys. We're getting there. We're building an argument from scratch that everything is the same. Essentially, the point of this lecture is that everything is everything, and Isaac Newton is the key to it. So we just figured out that polyrhythms are pitch, and rhythm is harmony, and there's all sorts of things we've talked about, but you heard everything so far. So I'm going to kind of like take those ideas and build on them a little bit. So part 5. It gets crazy now. You didn't think everything else was crazy? Oh, it gets a lot crazier. So, what happens when we speed a rhythm/pitch up beyond 20,000 hertz? So in the beginning, we had like the rhythm over here, and then we sped it up, and there was this like weird netherrealm in perception where we didn't know what was happening, and then we had pitch, and this is the audible spectrum of human hearing. What happens if we like go faster than that? Is there another sort of phenomenon that happens? We have two sorts of ways of experiencing the world and experiencing sound. We had rhythm, we had pitch. What happens over here? So, I'll let Samuel L. Jackson explain.
Hold on to your butts.
All right. So, we have an octave. This is an important thing. It's called octave equivalence. When you have a pitch, like at 440 hertz, the international standard for A, and it is 440 hertz. Let me be clear about that. So when you have that, and you, let's listen to that. It's 440 hertz. If you multiply that frequency by 2, this is also A. And that's a pretty, instinctual thing. We hear them as being both the same. Like one's higher, but it's kind of the same thing. It's like going all the way around the color wheel and getting back to where you started. It's just higher somehow. So we can keep doing that. Ooh, I'm going to turn it down just a little here. This is also an A. This is also an A. All of these pitches are also A. We keep going higher and higher. What about this one? Woo, that's pretty high. That's 7,040 hertz. That's also an A. And then this one is going to be really, really high. Woo. Okay, sorry about that, guys. This is kind of at the highest echelon of what we could probably expect for pitch perception. In fact, this is so high, I really didn't hear that for myself as being too pitched, because I've had hearing damage, like playing loud music for too long. So this is kind of at the upper range of my hearing. But then we have this note, which I didn't actually program because nobody here would be able to hear it. This note, we can't hear. This is beyond our range of hearing, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just that we don't perceive it as having pitch. It's still an A, according to our definition of octave equivalence. It still exists in the real world, as your dog will be able to tell, because this is the register of like dog whistles. It's just that we can't perceive it. Our gap in our perception has kind of like gone off the high end. So there's a gap in the perception between rhythm and pitch, and now there's going to be a huge gap in our perception of this phenomenon of like waveforms. And we can keep doubling it. Each one of these frequency numbers is still an A. These are all octaves of A. Eventually, when we keep just going higher and higher, and I didn't actually do this is not the right number, but I forgot to keep pressing enter on this. But anyway, let's pretend that's a high number. It is a high number. Eventually, you get into a pretty ridiculous place. When you get to vibrations occurring at trillions of times per second, you get into Mr. Isaac Newton's realm, the visible light spectrum. So when we're in this visible light spectrum, remember every multiple is still an A, we can calculate the color of A. Turns out A is orange. This is a great slide. I love this slide. I got this from Frank Javsey, who's another YouTube person. This gives the calculations of all the pitches, what we use today, just up 40 octaves. So when you're talking about these colors, A literally is orange. And if you think back to Isaac Newton's orange and blue are fifths, well, check it out. A is orange, E is kind of this indigo blue sort of thing, depending on, indigo blue sort of thing. He was right. Now he was, maybe not thinking in terms of tetrahertz because he didn't have the ability to measure that precisely, but maybe intuitively he was right. He understood that A and E are fifths. Now, this is a really exciting revelation that I had and I want to share with you guys. Because once we make this connection between color and sound in this literal way, not just a synesthetic way, because individual people with synesthesia will have different synesthetic experiences to different colors. This is literally what A is, orange. A is orange. We can now analyze visual media based upon the notes in this, notes in our chromatic scale. And this is a really exciting sort of thing, because we can take a look at this, Van Gogh's Starry Night, and we can analyze it musically. So we got this, yellow sort of thing, the yellow moon, and then it's, fairly blue and yellow, we can say. Maybe some different shades of blue, so we can check out, our organization of this thing, and we can see that, hey, yellow is a B flat, and then we have these couple shades of blue, let's say in between D and E flat. So we got B flat, D, and E flat, all really consonant intervals. There's a consonant polyrhythmic ratio between them. Between B flat and D, it's a major third. That's a 4:5 polyrhythm. 4:5 relationship in the frequency in tetrahertz in the visible light spectrum. And the same thing with B flat and E flat. It's a perfect fourth, 4:3 polyrhythm, 4:3 relationship in the visible light spectrum. So if we're going to like say, if we're going to put a song to this particular piece of artwork, it would be the Violent Femmes' Blister in the Sun. Do 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 do. B flat, D, E flat, D, B flat. We're getting pretty far out there, guys. Thank you for being here with me on this journey. But this is a That's the song that goes with this piece of artwork, at least if you analyze the color harmony in terms of the music. Let's do another one. Let's do Picasso's Night Fishing at Antibes. Wow, okay, so there's a lot of color in this one. There's a lot of things we can say about this one. One, we immediately understand that this somehow, on an instinctual level, not just for form and everything, but just this is a more dissonant painting. There's a lot more stuff. There are a lot more colors going on. You know, in the center upper area, the upper center area, there's kind of like this red, yellow, and blue thing at the very top. And that's kind of like where my eye sort of is immediately drawn to when I'm trying to make sense of this. Red, yellow, blue. And if you try and analyze the color harmony of that, that's G, B flat, D. That's a G minor triad that Picasso has given us. So that's kind of like this consonant sort of like realm in this piece of artwork. But there's a bunch of other areas where we see like blue and green right next to one another. And that, remember from Isaac Newton, he said that blue and green don't really go well together in this sort of sense. And you can kind of get the sense that blue and green create this sort of like tension here. And there's a lot of blue and green kind of like smushed next to one another in this particular painting. There's all sorts of different colors. And if I was to try and make a sort of musical analysis of what this painting would be, I would say this is kind of like atonal music or serial music. Music which requires a lot of attention to be paid to it. Now, like when we were talking about 15:8 and like the dissonant polyrhythms, I'm not saying it's impossible to feel, it just requires a lot more work. You have to work really hard to understand what 15:8 actually feels like and what it actually means. So I'm not the first person to make this connection between this style of artwork and 12-tone music. This guy was, WASSILY Kandinsky. Kandinsky was a turn of the 20th century artist who made these connections, and he liked to compare, he was a contemporary of Schoenberg, who was the inventor of the 12-tone system, and he liked to compare his artwork with the thoughts that Schoenberg was doing at the time, trying to liberate music from tonality. And so it's a really fascinating sort of experiment in like color and sound, and he was definitely thinking along these lines when he painted this guy. So we've sort of reached the conclusion of this Isaac Newton side of things. So to recap, pitch, rhythm, and apparently color are all kind of the same thing. And we can use those ideas to analyze artwork if we wanted to. That's a fun sort of, thing that we can do. And I like doing that. We can take this even further. All right, this is where it gets even further out. Harmony of the spheres. This is an ancient subject, an idea that the ancient Greeks had, which basically said that the orbits of the planets represented a sort of celestial music, a celestial harmony. And they meant it fairly metaphorically. They didn't literally mean that it was music, but they meant it in this sort of higher order, like this higher order that we couldn't hear this music, but it was still music nonetheless. And these ideas have influenced a lot of astronomers across the ages, including this guy, Johannes Kepler, who wrote this book, Harmonices Mundi, where he came up with this really interesting, and I find this really fascinating, he came up with this chart of the songs that all the planets sang, quote unquote, I think was the term he used. And he did it by measuring the speed at which each one of these planets moved at its fastest to the speed at which they moved at its slowest. So for Saturn, for example, you have a G going up to a B and returning down to a G. And so for him, he was measuring the ratio of 5:4 in terms of, that was Saturn's polyrhythmic ratio in terms of speed, how fast it was moving, how slow it was moving. Each one of the planets has an associated song. And also here, the moon also has a place. Good on the moon. All of these planets were discovered in his day, but there's of course more planets and planetoids and asteroids, which also have songs, quote unquote, that they sing. There's a more modern understanding of this, which is called orbital resonance. If you take like a moon as it's orbiting like a planet, and it takes maybe every 4 months to rotate around a given planet, and then you have another moon that rotates every 2 months, they form a 4-to-2 relationship or a 2-to-1 relationship. And the point at which they're both in the same place is called the point of orbital resonance, and that point keeps those bodies in the same sort of orbit. And there's a whole bunch of different examples of this. This is one example. Ganymede, Europa, and Io form this sort of tripartite system around Jupiter in this sort of orbital resonance. So you can see the little flashy guys. That's when they're being reinforced. There's a bunch of Wikipedia entries of known populations of resonance. We got a 2-3 resonances. We got a bunch of those. We got 3-5 resonances, which are at the major sixth. We have 4-7 resonances, which is at an interval called the harmonic seventh. We got a whole lot of them. They're just populating our solar system in the outer parts of our solar system. I'm going to kind of, skip around a little bit. Are these polyrhythms? Is orbital resonance, is harmony of the spheres, is light? Are these polyrhythms, the relationships between these two things? And I intentionally made this definition very vague because, yes, according to this definition, all these are X evenly spaced events in the same amount of time as Y evenly spaced events. That's really the crux of the whole thing. And I want to kind of contextualize what the hell we just covered, because we just covered a lot of things. We basically just said polyrhythms are everything. And that's basically what I wanted to get across to you guys. But there are two like main asterisks as I wrap this thing up. One, this whole basis of speeding up polyrhythms and then turning it into harmony is not literally going to always happen, because that was a form of just intonation. Just intonation is a system where we have simple mathematical relationships between two notes. Today we use equal temperament, where those simple relationships are skewed ever so slightly, and the reason why they're skewed is a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. But just know that the math is like almost there. It's not 100% there, but you still heard the major chord, and it's the same thing for a lot of different kinds of polyrhythms and a lot of different kinds of music. So just know that today we use equal temperament, but you just heard examples of just intonation. More importantly, technically light is electromagnetic radiation and not a compression wave like sound. So no, technically speaking, when you speed up a pitch, it's not going to turn into light. It never is, because sound is a compression wave. It needs a medium through which to propagate, and light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. So they're two different things, technically speaking. So to answer Mr. Isaac Newton's question, or to answer my question about Mr. Isaac Newton, is he speaking metaphorically when he uses musical terms to talk about color? And yes, he is speaking metaphorically, but metaphor extends perception. So this is kind of the crux of the whole thing. Metaphor extends perception, our ability to take these ideas about polyrhythms and apply it beyond what we can actually hear, and we can understand them through metaphor. We can extend our perception of the world a little bit more. So I'm going to leave you with this question. Do polyrhythms need to be explicitly heard/felt as sound to be music? Because we could analyze these paintings in terms of the color relationship, in terms of the sound relationships, and we felt the ideas of consonance and dissonance. We almost, I guess we could even say we felt the idea of a G minor triad, maybe there. We could use these sorts of musical ideas to understand these visual mediums. And I just wanted to leave you with that question because it doesn't need to be answered. Like, yeah, maybe technically it's not music, but you can still use musical ideas, or maybe it literally is music, who knows? We can use these musical concepts and feelings and intuitions that we all have as musicians or music lovers or sound designers, and we can use it to analyze any other form of art. This is really exciting to me, making these connections between things, because now my musical mind can like take a look at a Van Gogh and say like, aha, that is Blister in the Sun, or whatever. Like I can, it's a fun way of making connections because you can understand the world around you a lot better. I can make connections between things that our immediate perception cannot. So I'm going to leave you with this sort of idea. When people resist the idea of learning music theory or thinking critically about something that they really are passionate about, because it will lose, to them, the magic in it is in the mystery of it. I want to leave you with this idea is that thinking critically for me is the magic in learning about music, because you can extend what it is that you know and what you hear way beyond what you think you know and what you hear. And you can only really do that through critical thinking. And I hope I gave you some ideas to chew on here. And thank you, everybody, for attending this live edition of New Horizons in Music. And until next time.
Peace.